in the same way that the darkest time of day is just before dawn, the coldest is just after. In a darkened room, Cecilia Frobisher opened her eyes, which didn't seem to solve the problem of not being able to see. She shivered. It was the coldness which had woken her up, and she made to pull her knees up to her chest to ward off some of it. She was imprisoned. Well, she supposed, after flying at Lucius Malfoy with everything she had whilst surrounded by Death Eaters, she was lucky not to actually be dead. She swung herself round to a sitting position and stared into the darkness. Nevertheless, she was here, manacled, the locket she had fought so desperately to retrieve taken from her. Whatever was going to happen from here on in wasn't going to be pleasant. "We should report this," the wizard called Puss had said to Malfoy as Cecilia had stood in shock before them. "Come on, Mr. Weasley," Malfoy had said jovially, "let the woman have her say first." But she had made a run for it. Malfoy jumped in front of her, but it was Lithe Percy who had caught her. Cecilia struggled, stamping on his foot as his grip around her arms tightened, and she had shouted at him to get off as she pulled away from him. The knowledge that Molly and Arthur Weasley's third eldest son was involved with Death Eaters now firmly emblazoned in her mind. "Hey now, she knows you," a wizard from behind Lucius Malfoy had shouted as he had barred her way, and Cecilia had felt brazen anger well up in her stomach. "Know him? Of course I do. I know all of you. You're dark wizards in league with Voldemort." No one replied at first. The wizards broke into laughter which faded into exchanged looks of confusion. "What's Voldemort?" asked Percy Weasley as Cecilia looked in disbelief at the Death Eaters around them. "They must have got down there by accident, you know, stupid pranks like this. Cornelius would have a lot of work to do repairing relations with the Mole Prime Minister." Lucius Malfoy shook his head. "So much bad publicity dash." "But you are a Death Eater dash." "A what?" Malfoy's laughter trickled down Cecilia's back like warm treacle. "A Death Eater, in league with Voldemort," Cecilia cried, her tone begging for a little compassion from someone to let go the pretense. "Voldemort. Tom Riddle." As she looked around at the wizards again, Cecilia felt time stop. The wizards were laughing again, and it didn't seem to matter that only a few months ago she had been challenging them, Lucius Malfoy included, and had just emerged back through the veil having retrieved the locket that contained the last hidden part of Voldemort. "Percy," said Lucius Malfoy, glancing momentarily at Cecilia, "I'll leave this in your capable hands." "Come on," continued Percy Weasley, looking carefully at Cecilia and putting a hand on her shoulder, "you're obviously feeling confused." He looked past Cecilia and at Malfoy. "I'll take her to Grimmauld Place, Lucius, and dash. Sirius dash." Cecilia thought back to the moment she had mentioned Sirius's name. She had not intended to say it aloud, but once she knew she had blown it for the Order. She had failed. "You know Sirius?" This is the reason why, when Lucius Malfoy had asked her that question, she had flown at him, throwing her hands at his chest and pushing him before raising her leg in a kick, which had caused the Death Eater to yelp, catching her hands as Cecilia tried to lash out at his face. And that was the reason that she was now imprisoned. That wasn't what concerned her, though. What concerned her was the complete curtain of denial that had gone on. Why had they been treating her as if they didn't know her? They were Death Eaters, for heaven's sake. In her experience they were all too happy to lord their allegiance. Cecilia closed her eyes. Whatever was happening, she didn't understand it, and not being able to understand it made her feel anxious and worried. In her mind's eye she thought about what was supposed to have happened when she re-emerged from behind the veil. The Order would have been there, the battle undoubtedly in full swing. The Death Eaters, those she had just met again, they would have been their combatants as they waited for Voldemort to make his theatrical appearance, as he had done in February. Then Cecilia would have given over the locket to Dumbledore or to Harry, and the plan would have been complete. Why hadn't this happened? Why was she here, locked up by Death Eaters in clear denial of their allegiance? The imaginary battle scene by the archway faded and made way for another image. It was one she had conjured in her head since meeting him almost a year ago whenever she had felt lonely or miserable. She would imagine what he would say, or what he would do. She would imagine telling him her problems and worries and imagine what he would say in return. And when she had finally got together with Remus Lupin, the reality was almost exactly what she had imagined. He had comforted her. He had counseled her. He had opened up to her. He had not opened up to her entirely, but had run away from her when it had been close to the full moon and had kept from her the true horror of the effects of a lunar eclipse. But that didn't matter to her, it had never mattered. What mattered was that Snape, wherever he was, would be able to formulate a cure for him and her Remus would never have to suffer again. What mattered was that she saw him again and talked to him. Cecilia opened her eyes, but the image of her future husband remained before her eyes. She blinked, but Remus was still there, silhouetted by the light of the open prison door. Remus. Was he here, standing in front of her, here to rescue her? Cecilia was about to call his name, but he moved and closed the door behind him. Lumos. As light illuminated the room, Cecilia leaned forward, searching desperately for the physical signs that her beloved was there. A rush of adrenaline sped through her body, which crashed and burned in the pit of her stomach. The wizard was not Remus Lupin. Cecilia looked down. "Hello," said the wizard, walking towards her. "How are we feeling?" Cecilia looked up as the man sat on a chair opposite the bench which was set into the wall on which Cecilia had been sleeping. She looked up at a middle-aged man whose mild and friendly features made Cecilia feel her defensive barrier falter a little. He didn't look like the sort of wizard to be a Death Eater. An alarm bell went off in Cecilia's mind. What did the average Death Eater look like? And why was he here, talking to her whilst she was imprisoned by other Death Eaters? "Are you feeling okay?" the man pressed. "Is there anything I can get for you? Pumpkin juice? Tea? Water? And it'll be poisoned, or dosed with veritaserum, no doubt," replied Cecilia, taking in the man's features. Though she had never seen him before, he did, on the other hand, look familiar. And sound familiar. As Cecilia listened, the potential Death Eater laughed, clearly amused by her suggestion. "Not at all. No," the man replied. "Veritaserum." He shook his head. "The last time we used veritaserum was during the war." He frowned momentarily. "How did you know about that?" Cecilia said nothing. The war was only about 20 years or so ago, or now if you counted the rise of Voldemort again. She looked across to the wizard. Something didn't seem right, something didn't feel right about this. If she knew Death Eaters, and she had of course come across several in the last year, she knew they didn't hang around talking quietly and placidly as this wizard was doing now. "So," continued the man, "how was it you came to be in the Department of Mysteries and Beyond the Veil?" That seemed more like it. Cecilia shook her head a little as the new direct tack taken by the man roused a feeling of discomfort in her stomach. "I know that you were there," he went on. "You were shouting some preposterous things at my colleagues." Cecilia looked down again, past her hands and to her feet. She had been imprisoned by his so-called colleagues, and here he was wanting information? "Look," the man conceded, getting to his feet. "I can do something about those." He nodded towards Cecilia's manacles. "But you have to promise you won't try to attack me." Cecilia looked up, nodding slowly. "Engagio manacles." The wizard raised his wand, which he had had in his hand since the lights went on, and pointed it towards Cecilia's wrists. Within seconds the metal cuffs were dragging down her hands with the weight, but the holes that had bound her wrists so tightly were now bigger, and she slipped her hands through them, letting the metal confines fall to the floor. Ivanesco. The wildly enlarged manacles disappeared. Cecilia looked across to the wizard, an expression of gratitude on her face. The man nodded his head once before taking a few steps towards her and sitting back down. "Perhaps you could start by telling me your name?" "You really don't know who I am?" Cecilia asked, frowning at the man. "Even though I know your colleagues?" "No," the man replied, shaking his head. "I really don't know who you are, and neither do they. But Lucius was rather taken aback when you attacked him. He hasn't seen non-wizard aggression since the poll tax riots." Cecilia tried to assimilate the information the man was telling her, ignoring for simplicity his last comment. "What year is this?" 1997. "And you don't know who I am?" she repeated. "Why don't you tell me?" The man looked at her kindly and Cecilia felt her heart melt. She wanted to see Remus so badly. Remus, who was locked up in Azkaban and who seemed further away from her than ever. "Cecilia," said Cecilia. "Cecilia Frobisher." "Well now, Cecilia," replied the man. "My name's Kay. I work for the Ministry for Magic in Non-Wizard Relations." Cecilia nodded mutely. "So, how was it you ended up where you were?" Kay smiled and Cecilia felt herself smiling too. "I don't know. It was a lie, of course it was. But it seemed much simpler and far safer than the truth at the moment. It all feels so hazy. It all seems so unclear." "What can you remember?" There was a pause. A long absence of sound. Cecilia looked down and around her, and then sighed. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I want to help you," Kay replied. "A non-wizard, found by one of our mysteries. And it seems like you've got amnesia to boot. Where does your family live? Is there anyone I can contact?" As Kay spoke, images of the cottage that she and Remus shared, of an evening together with the windows open and a light breeze tickling the net curtains appeared in her mind. Her Remus, who was imprisoned in Azkaban. Her sister Amy then arose, holding the hands of her mother on one side and Freya on the other. Then, an image of her best friend flooded her mind, her darling friend Libby with whom she had shared everything. Murdered by Death Eaters. Cecilia looked across sharply to Kay as the paradoxical situation of the wizard denying he was a Death Eater and at the same time associating himself with Lucius Malfoy, and she dived towards the wizard, making for his left arm. Kay swerved and she fell forward, tearing the sleeve of his robe. As she fell backwards onto the flagstones his arm was exposed to the light and Cecilia gasped in horror. The wizard's arm was entirely absent of the dark mark. Kay was not a Death Eater. Leaning back on her hands Cecilia pulled herself into a cross-legged sitting position, rested her elbows and her head on her hands. Thoughts, ones which seemed so clear moments ago, seemed to be evading her a little as she chased them through her mind. Thoughts of Remus, and the Order. Thoughts of mysterious mythology and the morning of the first day when she had crept down the stairs and overheard Sirius scoffing at her involvement with wizards. Cecilia didn't know how long she sat on the cold floor of the prison cell as she pursued memories around her mind. It was only when she could not think any more about the situation that her self-pity was replaced with determination to find out what on earth was going on and, most importantly, get herself out of there and back to the Order. She looked up, blinking into the light. Kay, from his seat opposite the hard bunk, smiled gently, acknowledging her alertness. Cecilia stared back at the wizard and smiled too. And there was something in the smiles between them that made Cecilia think about the time that she had trusted Remus with the information about the genetics that she was investigating with the help of Nick Smith all those months before, and a surge of trustfulness began to grow in her stomach. Something was telling her that she could trust this man. "I was behind the veil for an important purpose," Cecilia heard herself saying. "But for the life of me I can't remember why." She smiled again, waiting for the wizard to reply. "I had a locket, but I don't seem to have it anymore." She tried to move, but her legs were stiff. Just as she leaned forward, Kay extended a hand. Cecilia took it and pushed herself up. "I'll look into it," Kay replied, looking her up and down. "I apologize for your imprisonment. You did attack a senior Arillo and it is procedure to imprison." He raised his wand and pointed it towards the door of the cell. "That, and the fact you came out from behind the veil when it is a classified artifact. Now dash." The noise outside the cell made both Cecilia and Kay look in the direction of the door. Instead of finishing his sentence, the wizard paced towards the brightness, holding onto its bars. "What have you got, Puss?" Kay leaned nonchalantly against the frame of the cell door, glancing back at Cecilia, who was sitting back on the bunk and staring at the floor. "Who is she?" "She should be a member of a fundamentalist non-wizard organization," replied Percy Weasley. "She should have been someone known to the Ministry who dared to bribe and to deceive Anna in order to break in here, in order to achieve some foul deed, in order to highlight the plight of non-wizards in an increasingly multicultural society." Percy stared at Kay and shook his head. "She should, at any rate, exist." "She doesn't exist," Kay returned Percy's stare with one of his own. "Surely that can't be possible?" "It shouldn't be possible. We've had our best men working on it for the best part of the morning. It's nearly midday and there's no trace of a Cecilia Frobisher anywhere, or any evidence of anything physical from the Occlumency." "Well, you were thorough," replied Kay, glancing back to Cecilia again. "She was asleep for almost 24 hours. Listen, do you think it might be something to do with the veil, the reason why we can't find anything?" He watched Percy Weasley sag at the shoulders. "I was just about to ask you the same question," he sighed. "I just don't know, and neither does Gregor. As far as he has anything to do with it, only a handful of people know that the veil even exists. The only thing we've got to go on was that she said she knew Sirius Black." Kay turned and looked back at Cecilia, still bent over her knees and staring at the floor, before smiling a little at Percy, who was turning something over and over his hands before giving it to Kay. The wizard nodded. "Perhaps that's our starting point." A few moments later Kay walked back into the cell, pausing next to Cecilia until she lifted her head. "I have to get back to work," Kay began. "You are free to go to wherever you want to go. Before you decide," he continued as Cecilia sprang to her feet, obvious rejuvenation in her action, "Percy has a proposition for you. Now, I don't think he'd be volunteering to take a non-wizard to Grimmauld Place, but you did say you knew Sirius Black. And your correspondence here mentions the address, even though it is a year out of date." He handed her the letter which had been taken from her after she had been stunned whilst attacking Lucius Malfoy. Cecilia looked at it and felt a lump in her throat as she opened and read through the letter. Grimmauld Place. Her words were not a question, just a statement as she read the address on the back. "You know where that is?" Cecilia nodded. "Do you know a wizard by the name of Sirius Black?" Cecilia nodded again, then wrinkled her brow as she wondered how he knew. "Percy said that you did when you came from beyond." Kay glanced in the direction of the prison cell door, watching the figure that was waiting there. "Yes," Cecilia replied. "I do know Sirius Black." "And you have your letter for an interview with Dumbledore?" The wizard looked back to Cecilia and smiled. "I think that pretty much swung it, to be honest," he added, getting to his feet. "Even though you can't remember how in heaven's name you ended up down there." He shuddered, making Cecilia feel a chill in the warm room. Doesn't bear thinking about. Cecilia looked at him and said nothing. Nothing seemed to make any sense at all at the moment. Nothing seemed right. "Come on," he said, looking towards the door. Cecilia's eyes darted towards it too, and the figure standing there. Was it a Death Eater come to take her away? Very probably. Perhaps Kay's demeanor belied his true intent. "I'll leave the door open and you can go with Percy when you're ready," said Kay when he realized that Cecilia wasn't about to follow him, and he tapped her comfortingly on the shoulder. There was something familiar in the gesture which made Cecilia instinctively respond by getting to her feet. "So you're not spies?" Cecilia asked as they stepped into the green stone corridor, noting the presence of Percy Weasley standing by the doorway. "The Order of the Phoenix is not at war with Voldemort and the Death Eaters?" She frowned as a feeling of hurtfulness passed through her. Both wizards were chuckling. "No," replied Kay in a voice Cecilia would otherwise have reserved for a naive child. "Don't be silly," added Percy Weasley, a grin on his face making his austere features transform into those of his twin brothers. "Kay, this mole thinks there's some sort of war on." Cecilia was about to reply when she saw the expression on Kay's face. "Mole?" chided Kay. "That's not politically correct, Puss. Less Sable." "Yes, Puss," said another man who had sidled up to the tall, red-headed wizard and gave him a grin. "I'm less able." "Dave Mullen!" exclaimed Kay, but the man called Dave Mullen continued, looking at Cecilia. "You mentioned a wizard called Tom Riddle?" Cecilia paused, trying to remember what she had said when she had seen Lucius Malfoy face to face. And then she remembered where she had seen the thin-faced wizard before. He had been when she had come out from behind the veil. "Tom Riddle, otherwise known as Voldemort," Cecilia nodded. Dave Mullen smiled, turning to the wizards on either side of Cecilia. "I know a Tom Riddle. So do you, Puss. Old Tom." Percy Weasley's expression of incomprehension dissolved away and was replaced by one of realization. "Old Tom!" exclaimed Kay, rolling his eyes. "Is his name Tom Riddle?" asked Percy. Dave nodded, glancing at Cecilia. "He works in non-wizard relations, with me," added Dave, addressing Cecilia now. "Ah, his stories. Like the one about being the last descendant of Salazar Slytherin," continued Percy. "I'll bet that what you've been saying'll go down a hoot back in the office, young lady." Dave turned and looked at Kay. "Are you ready?" Cecilia watched as Kay nodded and both of them began to walk down the long dark corridor, raising their hands in a wave to Percy Weasley. Cecilia turned to him, her shoulders sagging as all that she had been through flashed before her. "What now?" "Now?" Percy smiled. "You're free to go. But it's Ministry policy not to just let you out onto the street. I'll take you somewhere familiar." 88,888,888. For the second time in as many days she was standing on the doorstep of 12 Grimmauld Place. They flew to the phone box at the end of the street and despite Cecilia's knotted stomach she found it surprisingly easy. Percy Weasley continued to act as he had always done, treating her with mild disdain and with professionalism. There was nothing warm or comforting. Checking to see if she could make it down the street, Percy allowed Cecilia to support herself on his arm as she regained her strength and he remained quiet until she straightened up and made a few steps in the direction of number 12 and Cecilia glanced around her in the midday sunlight, taking in the information around her. The street seemed to be much lighter and less foreboding than on the occasions she had seen it before. It was as if someone had taken Grimmauld Place and given it a thorough wash, cleaning the ingrained dullness out of the fabric of the scene. "I have to say, I've never seen a braver mole," Percy said, following her slowly. "You may yet feel some after effects," he added, pausing by Cecilia's side before the steps of the house, not hidden as it had been between the houses adjacent but sitting boldly between numbers 10 and 14. "Callias was right, you aren't crazy, just confused." He patted her shoulder as Cecilia's mouth fell open. "Callias? Mum will sort you out," he added, smiling a little at Cecilia. And then, just as Cecilia turned to question him, Percy Weasley nodded towards her before disapparating with a loud crack. She was alone. Standing on the doorstep of 12, Grimmauld Place. Alone. Well, there was nothing else for it. Cecilia pulled up the metal gargoyle shaped on the thick front door, holding it away from the metal plate, and knocked.